afternoon. I'm Heather Kostick, the admin coordinator for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, and I'm here to introduce our event and welcome you to another Climate Week event. This event is titled Climate Optimism with Michael Mann and Dan Utech. We're excited to be able to host this discussion with the representative from the Environmental Protection Agency. I encourage you to check out our other events later this week on the PCSSM or Climate Week website. So allow me to introduce our speakers. Our first one is Dr. Michael Mann, Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, and newly appointed Vice Provost for Climate Science Policy and Action. And he has a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School for Communication. His research focuses on climate science and climate change. He was selected by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002, and was awarded the Hans Oeschger Medal of the European Geophysical Union in 2012. He received the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2019 and was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2020. He's a fellow of AGU, AMS, GSA, AAAS, and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He's the co-founder of RealClimate.org and the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, including numerous op-eds and commentaries, and 6 books, including Dire Predictions, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, The Madhouse Effect, The Tantrum That Saved the World, The New Climate War, and Our Fragile Moment. Our second speaker is Dan Utech, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Dan Utech is the, hopefully I get this right, Administrator Michael Regan's Chief of Staff, yes, of the U.S. EPA. Dan has over 20 years of experience in environmental policy and has served as Deputy Assistant to President Obama for energy and climate change, leading the White House and cross-governmental teams to develop and implement energy and climate change policy. Dan has also served as a Senior Advisor to the Department of Energy Secretary Stephen Chu. Prior to his federal agency experience, Dan worked in the Senate for 10 years, where he worked on a range of environmental and energy policy issues, including for Senator Hillary Clinton. Dan started his Washington career at EPA as a presidential management intern. He has been a lecturer at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, from which he received a MES degree. He also holds degrees from the Yale School of Management and Amherst College. So without further ado, I turn it over to Mike and Dan.
Thanks very much, Heather. Thanks to all of you for coming out for this event. I see a number of friendly faces, some students, faculty, colleagues of mine. Great to have you all out here for this discussion. So what we're going to do is I'm going to basically be in conversation. It's a fireside chat. We apologize that there's no actual fire here. We were told we couldn't have a fire in Huntsman Hall. So it's a virtually fireside chat about sort of what, progress has been made. I mean, the title of the event, Optimism. I'll just sort of preface the conversation with this point. It's something I talk a lot about. I know I talk with my students about sort of climate nihilism and doomism, this idea that it's too late to do anything. As I like to say, today the primary threat to climate action isn't climate denialism, it's climate nihilism. The notion that it's too late to do anything. And many of our younger folks, Gen Z, have sort of become disillusioned by what they perceive as a lack of progress. So I suppose this event is hopefully a bit of an antidote to that because we've actually made a lot of progress. And it's possible to hold in one's mind these two seemingly conflicting facts that, yes, we haven't made enough progress. There's still much more to be done. And we need to continue, for example, the efforts of what has been established over the past 4 years. That alone isn't enough, but it provides a basis, something to build upon. And so it's possible for, for there to be, for it to be true that we haven't made enough progress, and yet at the same time, we've made a lot of progress. And I think, in Dan's comments, you'll get a sense of how much has been accomplished over the last 4 years, and hopefully what we can do going forward, depending on how this election goes, which is up to a whole lot of you. It's about voting. It turns out our city, Philadelphia, in our state of Pennsylvania, may determine, in my view, the future course of global climate action. Because as goes Philadelphia, voting, potentially goes Pennsylvania, potentially goes the presidency and our Senate, and whether or not the United States, the world's largest legacy polluter on the planet, moves forward or retrenches. And if we do the latter, then it sends a signal to the rest of the world. We're the biggest polluter, and we're not willing to do our share. It's easy to imagine sort of any global negotiations to begin to fray at the edges and fall apart. And so it really is so important for us to vote, and for you to make sure everybody you know who's a voting age, you registered voter, still a few days to register, by the way, gets out and vote, because these are the stakes. They couldn't be more stark. And I think we'll get a sense, again, the fact that we've made some real progress. We need to continue that progress in the 4 years ahead. So, along those lines, Dan, tell us a bit about what progress we have made over the last 4 years.
Sure. I'm going to, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here in the room and online. I want to be clear that in my capacity, I'm here as the chief staff of the US EPA, so I'm not here to represent a candidate. I'm here to talk about the work of the administration. So thank you.
I have signed no such paperwork myself.
So I want to rewind just a little bit and go back to the Obama presidency, the Obama campaign. I think President Obama was really the first candidate to run on a very significant climate platform. I believe he called for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. There was a legislative proposal behind that. Interestingly, and kind of an interesting footnote, his opponent, Senator John McCain, actually had a kind of similar proposal. I think he called for like a 2/3 cut, not an 80% cut, and there were probably some loopholes in there that President Obama didn't have in his plan. But that was really the first campaign, I think, where this was an issue that got significant attention in that kind of way, putting on the table a set of goals and potential solutions. And during his time in office, when you think about the tools that a president, the administration has, one is to propose legislation to Congress and to push for that legislation to get through. And then a second is really just to mobilize your cabinet, the government, to use the funding and the regulatory and other tools that you have in hand to make progress. And so, President Obama really focused the first couple of years on trying to get his legislation through. He actually got a bill through the House, wasn't able to pass the Senate. So from that point forward, really focused on what could he do with the convening power that he has as president to get partnerships and things going and encourage the private sector, the non-government sector to take action, but also what tools did he have in terms of regulatory authorities to put standards in place to drive carbon pollution, other kinds of air pollution, water pollution down. I was not at EPA at the time, I was at the White House, but EPA was really at the center of that, so there were a set of standards on vehicle emissions, on power plant emissions, on emissions from oil and gas. Some of those things stayed in place and have carried forward, others were blocked in the courts. But it was really the first time that a president and administration really took concerted effort, used kind of all the tools at their disposal to make progress here. And one little footnote, although the president's climate bill didn't pass, there was funding that passed right away. And then at the end, there was legislation that passed that extended certain tax credits for renewable energy. And that was actually quite important to carry that work forward and to continue accelerating deployment of renewables during the Trump presidency, because those credits were in place there. So fast forward to President Biden, he came in and I think just took it one step further. Oh, one more thing back on President Obama. Probably one of the most important things that he did as president was make sure that his team in the international space was really forward-leaning, was putting forward aggressive targets on behalf of the U.S., was demanding that of other countries, including China. And that work all culminated in 2015 at the Conference of the Parties that year, the international climate discussions really a new framework that we're still living under today, where countries bring forward their targets, their pledges, and come back every year to sort of check and check each other as to how that they're doing. And so the President Obama set a target of about 23 to 25% below 2005 emissions by year 2025. When President Biden came in his first year in office, he upped the game and set a target of 50 to 52% by 2030. So President Biden came in, set aggressive targets, both the overall target, but also 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035, 50% EV sales by 2030, or just a couple, and then backed that up in a big way through both his legislative proposals, which he was able to enact. I think the president himself, the climate movement, learned a lot from the Obama years in terms of how to organize and what types of things to push for. And so the result of that is the Congress passed, thanks to the president's leadership and Democrats in the House and the Senate. I say Democrats because no Republicans voted for the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, it was Manchin.
Oh.
Sorry, Joe Manchin is a Democrat.
So that bill, the IRA, is the most significant legislation on climate in history. And that sounds hyperbolic, but I think it's true because it's by far the biggest bill in the U.S. I think in terms of the estimated emissions reductions out of that bill, it's at least 10x anything else you can point to. And as Professor Mann was pointing out, and as I've alluded to a little bit, U.S. leadership in catalyzing global action is critical. And so I think when you put those things together, that bill was and is hugely consequential, and importantly, will continue to be. So I think we're really just starting to see the impacts of that legislation, which was passed in August of 2022. The president also, right out of the gate, I think his climate executive order was on day 6 or 7 or something like that. He was really ready to go, and I think in a lot of ways has compressed into one term, 2 terms worth of action in this space between the legislation and the other work, directed everybody to get to work. And so at EPA, that's meant regulations for, again, power plants, vehicles, methane emissions from oil and gas, reducing HFC emissions use by 85%. So at a very high level, I think that's been the change. I think President Obama really got started, was able to put some things in place that, like the international framework, some of those tax credits that have carried through to President Biden, who just upped the game from there.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things I think that was really important during the Obama years, as you noted, he failed to get through a climate bill, and Republicans, fossil fuel interests, were very effective in mobilizing their people to prevent a bill from passing. But through executive actions, through the Clean Power Plan, and through tighter fuel efficiency standards for vehicles, I would argue with the executive actions that he put in place, that's what gave him authority when he went, at the table with other leaders of other countries. We're making real progress here. It gave him authority. It helped negotiate with China this bilateral agreement, which laid the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. And all of that, in a sense, was possible, I think, because of the successes that he was able to achieve in the executive realm. Of course, as you note, we're now dealing with an even more, I will say this, we're dealing with an even more conservative Supreme Court that has been far more aggressive in blocking executive actions, and that's something that we need to understand going forward. So lessons learned from those past experiences, going forward, looking, to the next 4 years.
Yeah. Well, so I think, there were probably a lot of lessons out of the Obama years. I think one thing that came out of that, and I think living through the next administration, the climate movement organized in a more significant way, I think, and around a different type of proposal. I think the legislation that President Obama backed wasn't really a grassroots kind of thing. It was more like a beltway thing. And I think the ideas that President Biden incorporated when he ran in 2020 really more kind of grassroots sourced, and just took a different approach. The Obama idea was sort of a hard emissions cap, more of a regulatory approach. The Biden legislation is more incentives for clean energy, R&D, for deployment incentives and the like, for both businesses, for individuals. So I think it was just sort of a different approach, informed in large part by like the art of the possible in Congress, as well as what we thought would be effective. And I think on the regulatory side, of course, there were lessons learned there. So our vehicle standards held up. Our Clean Power Plan, which was the Obama power plant rule, was stayed by the Supreme Court before it was implemented. And then, bore you with the litigation that happened since then. Just yesterday, we got a decision from the Supreme Court, a different court, a quite different court than was in place in 2015, 2016 timeframe. They declined to stay our power plant rule, our targeting greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a super positive development, and a way of saying that, I think we've learned too as an agency about how it makes sense to approach things, given the landscape that we live in from a regulatory point of view.
Michael Regan actually spoke here some months ago at the Society for Environmental Journalists conference that we hosted, and made that point that they've been very strategic, and they sort of figuring out where the obstacles are and how to sort of still make progress in this, in a more restrictive and adversarial environment that now exists with the courts. So then going forward, lessons learned from the last 4 years that inform what our priorities might be going forward.
Yeah, well, I think just to kind of break it down a little bit in terms of the task in front of the U.S. and we talked a little bit about how what the U.S. does is very important globally, and there's a certain kind of leverage around what we do here in terms of our credibility in the international forum and our ability to continue to make progress there. I should say, I gave a brief talk at Professor Mann's class this morning. One thing I think that's probably underappreciated is that, whatever the specific people might know that the Clean Power Plan was blocked by the Supreme Court, et cetera. But if you look at what's happened since 2015 and the Paris Accords were put in place, and President Obama had his pledge and others came forward with their pledges. Fast forward to today, and you look at the range of expected warming based on the emissions trajectory that we're on now, we've actually shaved like a significant chunk, maybe a degree C or more off the sort of top end of that range. So I think that's just a good example of, there's a lot of news about impacts, about storms. There's kind of less obvious coverage about the progress that we're making. And I think that, for a lot of reasons, the power sector, cleaning up our grid, cleaning up our electricity is kind of the linchpin to our decarbonization strategy. It's also the place that we've made the most progress. So under the IRA, we have significant incentives for deployment of renewables, building on really a couple decades of finding out what works, what doesn't. So, for example, the incentives that were in place previously generally were in the form of tax credits, which were largely available to entities that had tax liabilities. You have to have a tax liability to take tax credit. Exactly. The incentives in the IRA are actually available to anybody. So you can get those in the form of cash in lieu of a tax credit. So they're just more widely available to a variety of entities. So that's one example. So we have incentives on one side for both businesses and for individuals. So an example on the individual side, there's up to a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles that's available to people. So we have incentives over here, and then we have regulations and standards, technology standards that we've worked on at EPA. So our vehicle standards, for example, in the last 3.5 years, put in place for both light-duty vehicles, so those are like cars and trucks that people drive, as well as heavy-duty vehicles, the full range of trucks from heavy pickups to like 18-wheelers that you can see on the highway. New standards, tighter greenhouse gas standards for model years 2027 to 2032, and collectively, over the lifetime of the vehicles covered by those standards, it's going to reduce about 8 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's, I don't know, that's maybe 5x what our annual transportation emissions are. So that's a big chunk. And I think if you look across the power sector and across transportation in particular, we have both incentives that have been put in place by the IRA and a regulatory framework that's going to continue to be implemented in the coming years. So I think in addition to protecting and fine-tuning and implementing both the incentives that we have and implementing those standards that I talked about, which just by nature are kind of set a few years ahead of when they actually kick in, that's a big chunk of what is available in the next 4 years. And then, you know, using the tools that we have to continue to make progress with additional sectors. So we've gone after, we've made progress, we've set standards for some of the biggest sources. I'll mention methane emissions from oil and gas, where we've set standards that will reduce emissions about 80%. And I've already mentioned HFCs, which are being phased out, and which globally, if phased out, will avoid a full degree of global warming. So those are just a couple of the opportunities in front of us.
Yeah, so you would think with those, EV credits that the owner of the largest EV company in the country would be out there supporting the continuation of these policies rather than going backwards. Let me ask about we have a lot of young folks, well, like increasingly with each passing year, everybody gets younger and younger relative to me. So we're sort of past the tipping point now. Simon's there with me. We got a few of us old timers, but there are a lot of young folks in the room, and including my students up there. And what specifically, what is the administration doing to really to address the concerns of young folks, young voters? As I said, there's a lot of sort of doomism. Climate anxiety is something we talk a lot about. We do some actual focus group work on that here with Kate. And so there's some real obstacles right now to engaging young folks. And potentially some of that translates to a lack maybe of the enthusiasm we'd like to see in some circles for coming out and participating in this election. So tell us about what we're doing here to reach young folks, to address their concerns.
Well, I guess I'd say a couple things. First of all, I think I want to come back to a point I made about President Biden and the ambition that he embraced on climate during his campaign in 2019 and 2020. And to me, that was the big change from previously was the climate movement, which was largely driven by young people, people who demanded, movements who demanded more aggressive targets and also coalesced around a specific kind of approach that ultimately passed in the form of the IRA. Not exactly as the president proposed it or as the community envisioned it, but very much in line with what came out of that period between 2016 and 2020 in the climate movement, which, as I said, was a lot of the energy and ideas came from young people in that movement. So I think that's like exhibit A in recent history as to the kind of difference that young people can make when they engage.
We just had an event the other day. Simon sort of hosted this conversation with Louisa Neubauer, and it was the other.
Helena Marshall.
Helena Marshall is sort of leading in Germany the Fridays for Future movement, and we had a good showing there. But it's still going strong. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's point one that I would make. I guess the second thing I would say is we are always the president and my boss, Michael Regan, the administrator of EPA, always trying to think about different ways to engage young people. So you may know that the president proposed and got enacted something called the American Climate Corps. And the idea is to, the goal for year one, which I think is just about in the books now, is to get 20,000 young people to work in a variety of capacities and for a variety of terms and different places on climate-related work. And I saw a report about a month ago out of the White House that they had 15,000 people through that program already. So I think that's been a huge focal point for both the president and the administration. We have a little chunk of that at EPA.
Students who are interested in potentially pursuing that, what do they do?
Yeah, just Google American Climate Corps, and I was actually on it this morning. I think there are about 150 open opportunities that are on the website as of this morning. So, as I said, they're sort of in different places and for different periods of time and all of that, and for a whole bunch of different agencies inside the government. So it's definitely worth checking out as you think about internships, summer jobs, etc. So I think that's a big one, because I think we, any of us who've come through a program like that, and I came through a program kind of like that out of grad school, is just such an important way, whether people want to work in government for a chunk of their career or not, it's just a great way to get exposed to the issues and ways in which you can be positively engaged in working on the whole set of issues under the climate umbrella. At EPA, the administrator, who is a relatively young guy, I think he was 43 or so when he got the job. So
that is really young.
That's really young as far as I'm concerned. He's really made youth engagement a priority in a variety of ways, including standing up the first ever youth advisory council at EPA. So we have in the federal government these formal advisory councils, and every agency has a whole bunch of them that look at different things. So at EPA we have a clean air advisory, scientific advisory council. We have a range of these councils, and the administration said we need to have one for young people. So we just convened it for the first time about a year ago, I think. And we have people ranging from like juniors in high school up to about the ripe old age of 28 or 29. And they are, they're learning about EPA, and they're also providing input to us. So we can incorporate that kind of thinking.
Great, yeah. I mean, so take notes. Some of you might potentially be interested in some of these opportunities, especially if you're taking time off, gap year before graduate school. It seems like, serving the same role that the Peace Corps has served in the past in some ways, yeah. Let me ask you, so something else that's very much in sort of the current media discourse, FEMA, this slew of extreme weather disasters, most recently in the form of Helene and then Milton, what's interesting is, first of all, it's sort of taxing our resources, and people are wondering how many of these, for how long can we continue to sort of to deal with this barrage of extreme weather events? Is FEMA, is it budget, depleted? Are they able to continue with this work? There's also massive misinformation and disinformation that we're dealing with. The whole idea that atmospheric scientists are actually causing these hurricanes. We've got a weather machine, and we're aiming them right at Florida, right, impact the election, I guess, which, we would laugh at, except for the fact that there's probably like 30% of the population that actually believes this stuff, because there has been such a massive online disinformation effort on social media, and it's really effective, and it's sowing distrust in government institutions. It's making it difficult for FEMA to, ironically, to do its job and to help provide support for people who have been impacted by these. So, how are we dealing with this?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that question, because it's near and dear to us at EPA. We have inside of EPA an Office of Emergency Management. So we have, I think about 150 or so people whose title is on-scene coordinator. And these are people whose bags are packed, and when stuff hits the fan, they're out the door. And so we have people deployed in North Carolina, in Georgia, Florida, and we roll up under FEMA. So in these response efforts, FEMA's sort of umbrella over the top and running the incident command centers, but EPA folds in along with other agencies, and our primary responsibilities relate to dealing with hazardous materials. So our people have been out in North Carolina, for example, collecting propane tanks and things like that that have been dislodged by the flooding. And really importantly in these particular responses, working with state and local authorities to get water systems back online, drinking water systems, wastewater treatment systems that have been affected. So, so we have people out there now. I think the disinformation around this response has been really just, I don't know what the right word is to use, but there are people out there who really need help and who are being fed information that is suggesting to them that they can't count on FEMA and others, or just misleading in a variety of ways. So that is just another thing that makes the job harder to do, but the people who are ultimately hurt by that are the people who need the help the most. From what I understand, I think FEMA has enough resources to get through, let's say, to November, early December. I think Congress is going to have to address this when they get back. I think even Speaker Johnson, the House Speaker, has said that, if you threw out a ballpark number of $100 billion. So that's that's the scale of the impacts that we're now dealing with, that we're seeing out of these storms.
I mean, Milton, Helene was probably exceeded 10 billion, certainly, right? Tens of billions of dollars in damage. It was interesting to me, the states that you listed there, I couldn't help but notice that they are battleground states. If you include Florida, arguably, is one, Carolina, Georgia, and they're really battleground states in multiple senses. They're political battleground states, but they're on the battleground of dealing with the increasingly catastrophic consequences of climate change. And it's sad to think that so many people are potentially voting against their own interest in not recognizing that what the true solution to this problem ultimately has to be. Let me, finally, we've got a few minutes left, I think, before we open it up to Q&A, and I guess we'll do that both with the folks who are physically present, and Heather, we've got some folks online too.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll help with that.
So, and we sort of got at that here with this last question, but EPA's mission, strictly speaking, is to protect the environment, but you can't really separate the environment from the health of our environment and the health of us and public health. And so can you talk a little bit about how the EPA views that sort of dual role?
Yeah, I mean, our sort of one-line mission motto is protect public health and the environment. So, we view ourselves as, and I think we very much are, a public health agency first and foremost. And climate is a huge focus of what we do at the agency. It's a big priority for the president, for Administrator Regan. We've done a lot of work on that over the last 3.5 years. But, in addition to that, clean air, clean water, cleaning up contaminated sites, doing science, communicating with the public. I mean, these are kind of our core, that's our core mission. We have, I'll just highlight a few things we've worked on in the last 3.5 years kind of across that space. So thanks to the president's leadership, he's kind of taken this approach across the board. So we got significant historic level of investment through this bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in the fall of 21. EPA was entrusted with $50 billion of funding to put towards clean water, safe drinking water, clean water infrastructure. Mostly that flows through the states, through existing channels that we have with the states. But there were a couple things about that legislation that were different than before. First of all, 15 of the 50 was sort of specifically purposed to deal with lead service lines. These are the lead pipes that are in cities like Philly and older cities around the country that go from sort of the water mains to individual homes. There's about 9 million of those left, we estimate, around the country. The president set a goal of eliminating all of them, 100%. So first thing he did was secure funding, and then the second thing he did was ask EPA to get to work on updating a set of rules that had languished really for decades. And just last week, 2 weeks ago, maybe it was last week, the president announced a final set of standards that will require replacement of 100% of those lead service lines within 10 years. So he put resources against the problem, but also sort of put a hammer in place as well. So we've taken action on lead and water. We've also set the first ever national standards to deal with PFAS. These are these forever chemicals that you might have heard about that are harmful and very, very, very persistent in the environment, and also very harmful in very small quantities. So that will protect about 100 million Americans, we estimate, who are currently exposed to levels that we think are unhealthy. So a bunch of progress on the waterfront, which, I think in some ways, I'm kind of a climate guy, but that's a super tangible thing for everybody, drinking water.
Well, they're connected in a very real way. There was a study that some of you may have read, the headlines came out a couple weeks ago, a study in the journal Nature, finding that a major landfalling hurricane has health impacts for decades. A single event can impact human health for decades for reasons that you're sort of alluding to. A storm, can compromise, toxic waste sites. There are lots of ways that it can lead to these more persistent human health challenges. And so there's a direct relationship between these discrete extreme weather events that are being made more frequent and intense by climate change and some of these longer term problems that we face.
Absolutely. If I could mention just a couple other things, and I know we might have time for questions, but
we're right on schedule.
We're right on schedule. All right. So we also, one of the priorities for Administrator Regan, for the president too, but also for Administrator Regan, he's the first black man to run the EPA. So environmental justice has been high on his list. He is from North Carolina himself. He ran the state environment agency before coming to EPA. So environmental justice has been a big priority for him, and we've taken a number of steps in that direction. But one particular thing I want to mention in terms of air pollution, one of the first places that he visited was what's known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana. This is a place where there are a lot of petrochemical facilities. We earlier this year finalized a set of standards that will reduce emissions from that set of facilities by 96%, reduce cancer risks from emissions from those facilities by 96%. So that's a real win, and I think there's more to come. You asked earlier about the future and climate. I think there's more to do there at EPA in terms of reducing air toxics, which is not something we focused on as much as some other air pollution issues. And then the other thing I would just quickly mention, between the two bills, the infrastructure bill, the IRA, EPA was entrusted with $100 billion. We are annually a $10 billion agency, so that gives you a sense of the scale of resources that, thanks to the President's leadership and congressional action, we've been able to deploy in the last 3.5 years. And I'll just tick through a couple of things in case people are interested, might have questions. $5 billion in school buses, and I think there's about 21 school districts here in Pennsylvania that have availed themselves of that program. $5 billion to fund state and local plans to plan to have a climate action plan, but also to fund measures to implement that plan. Pennsylvania is a recipient there as well, about $400 million to put in place a program that's focused on industrial emissions in particular, which is one of the harder sectors to get at in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have a Solar for All program, $7 billion to deploy solar, particularly 100% in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Pennsylvania is also part of that, to the tune of about $156 million. So we've just had an extraordinary opportunity to work across the board, and I think I mentioned the $50 billion for water. So climate's been a huge focus, but we've also had the opportunity, the leadership support at EPA and from the president on down to tackle water pollution issues, air toxics, and also accelerate the cleanup of contaminated sites around the country.
Well, to put those numbers in context, we get very excited here at Penn when we get $10 million for our climate plans.
Yeah.
So you can do a lot with billions of dollars, and that's, and ultimately those are the priorities that this election is going to decide. Do we continue to provide the resources necessary to help people who are already dealing with the impacts of climate change, especially the most vulnerable frontline communities, and to actually make progress in preventing additional warming and additional climate change? Those are the stakes in this election from my standpoint. I'm speaking as from my Penn position here. Let's open this up to questions. And first we'll start with people in the room, especially students. Please ask. Great opportunity. Yeah, right here first. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I was curious, given your experience, it sounds like you kind of started off in the public sector and have been working there for a while. And I was just curious, as a young person looking to make an impact on climate and kind of like looking between the private and public sector, why maybe you chose the public sector and where you see like more impact maybe potentially being made, or like what advice you would have for a young person kind of trying to figure out where to go in terms of climate.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So I think so much has changed since I got into this 25 years ago. I chose to go into government out of grad school, and I think I thought at the time I was going to kind of move back and forth between the private sector and government. And I just kind of ended up having opportunities that were interesting enough that I just sort of kept taking the next step. But I think the reality is that it's going to kind of take everything we've got, and really from a technology deployment perspective, that is the private sector. The private sector has to provide the technology solutions, has to provide the financing, has to provide the investment. And in a lot of ways, the programs in the IRA are really designed to catalyze that. It's not a substitute for, it's a catalyst to bring that investment off the sidelines. So I mentioned the Solar for All program at EPA. We got another $20 billion to fund nonprofit finance entities who are going to turn around and give loans and other products, and we estimate the leverage from that program is going to be about 7 to 1. So we're going to attract 7 private dollars for every $1. So I think, getting back to your question about where do you want to plug in, I think there's so many, kind of every part of the economy, every part of the private sector is going to be involved in some way. I think for me, it starts with what kinds of things do you like to do, and where are you able to do those things? Because I think the opportunity space is pretty huge today. There's so many different types of ways that you can work as compared to when I got in, where there was just like, let's say in 97, we were talking earlier, so we're about 20% renewables right now in the US in terms of generation, share of electricity generation on an annual basis. It was about 6 or 7, I think, when I got into this line of work. That was all hydro. There was like virtually nothing else. There are now huge industries around renewable energy in this country and around the world. So that's just one example. So I think it's more about like, what kind of environment do you want to work in? What kind of things do you like to do, and do you think you're good at, to help you answer that question?
Great. So one of my students from my class here, yes.
This is kind of in line with what you're talking about, like FEMA, but I was wondering, with the Inflation Reduction Act, what are ways that the EPA or like local entities can, I guess, try and incentivize states or localities that might not be the same party as the administration and might have some misinformation in regards to the Inflation Reduction Act, but would benefit a lot from those incentives. What are ways that the EPA tries to, like, I guess, breach that gap?
Just in terms of getting the word out about what's in the IRA and like what the opportunities are there for people, is that? I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
lost the
just
question
like,
halfway through.
I'm from a state that I know, like, would benefit a lot from a lot of the things that you've mentioned in the Inflation Reduction Act, but would not, I think, like, accept that aid, a lot of the politicians that I've met. So what are ways that, like, the EPA or I guess like other entities try to encourage that?
It's a really good question, and I think, so part of the IRA is like the programs that came through EPA, where we generally, by and large, they were grant programs. So we ran competitive processes, accepted applications, scored them, made selections, made the awards. So on Solar for All, for example, it was sort of available first and foremost to states, but also other entities. So we had a small handful of states where either we didn't get an application or it didn't score well enough to get an award. But it was surprisingly few. I think the number, I'm looking at my colleague Nate, I think it was maybe only 4 or 5 states didn't apply for that funding, which I think speaks mostly to the cost effectiveness of solar as a solution and the popularity of that as a solution. But yeah, there were other cases where, for example, we had another program, Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program, I mentioned that as well, where we got, I think, again, the overwhelming majority of states came in for the funding, but not quite as many there as for Solar for All. So a long way of saying, like, I think when the funding was on the table, most of the states actually came in to try to get it. So that's thing one. Thing two is a lot of the rest of the IRA was really incentives for the private sector and to build clean energy manufacturing, to build battery manufacturing, solar manufacturing, and to build projects, renewable projects, et cetera. That funding has kind of gone all over the place and really depends on a lot of things not having to do with whether you're a blue state or a red state. So that's pretty widely distributed, I would say. And those kinds of decisions are just being made by private sector actors based on their own incentives and calculations, as opposed to the political preferences of whoever the leadership of whoever's in the governor's office or whatever. Not saying that those folks don't have a role that matters, but a big part of the IRA was aimed at putting incentives in place for the private sector to go out and build things. And that's kind of happening everywhere.
In regards to, like, the private sector grants and incentives, are there also aspects of the IRA that, like, are meant to incentivize, like, education for workers that are, like, currently in fossil fuel industries and might be out of a job if these private companies transition so quickly?
Yeah, so I can't speak directly to the IRA, but one of the first sort of cross-governmental initiatives that the president stood up was a interagency working group focused just on this issue of, like, let's go out to places where we know, based on the plans of the local utility, that they have a coal-fired power plant that's going to close in 5 years. Let's get in front of that and provide training and other resources in a coherent way and in a way that's easier for local leaders and members of the community to access. So just yesterday we were in the Region 3 office, EPA's Region 3. The Mid-Atlantic region is headquartered here in Philadelphia. So we were at the office yesterday and spoke to a woman there who has been working on this for the last couple of years, like in Pittsburgh area, for example. So the short answer is yes. I think we've been working hard to, in just those types of communities, present sort of single point of entry to the community. I mean, it's kind of the approaching the federal government, I think, can be bewildering for a lot of people, and so we've tried to make that as easy as we can.
Great. Other questions?
We have Zoom questions too, so I just want to.
Okay, so we'll do the Zoom one next. I saw somebody over.
I know there's a lot. Yes, this
We'll
one
go.
should be a short.
Yeah, we'll let's do sort of like more of a rapid fire sort of.
This should be a short answer.
All right, well, let's do that one. Okay.
This person asks, how can youths be part of the EPA Youth Advisory Council?
So I think we're full up for now. You could check out, I would just check out the website, and there may be a way to sign up, but generally the way those councils work is that people rotate on and off over time. So we just stood it up last year, so I think the current membership has been pretty stable, but there will be vacancies over time.
Okay, so one of my students and then Vanessa. Yep.
Okay, so I know that there was like a ruling that the Supreme Court passed in 2022 that made it more difficult for the EPA to regulate carbon emissions. So with all of these carbon reduction goals, how did that ruling impact that your work in that area?
Yeah, so
Chevron.
I think you're probably referring to West Virginia versus EPA, which was really kind of relitigating the Obama era, or not relitigating, it took that long for a variety of reasons for the Obama 2015, 2016 power plant rule to wind its way through the courts. And, in that specific case, the Supreme Court said, EPA, this kind of approach that you took in designing that program, that's not allowed. So, of course, we respect the court's decision. We incorporated that into our thinking in the rule that we finalized in April of this year. And as I said just yesterday, the court declined to stay the rule, so you can petition the court to stop the implementation of the rule. You generally have to show that it's going to, implementation of the rule will, in the near term, cause irreparable harm, and you also convince the court that you're likely to succeed on the merits, meaning that you're going to ultimately win in whole or in part in saying that what EPA did was against the law. The court declined to do that in this case. So I think that's a good sign for us in terms of learning from those decisions and building a program that fits within the parameters.
Was there a change of heart on the part of the SCOTUS?
Well, interestingly, weird thing about stay, the court doesn't really generally have to write an opinion often. So when the Clean Power Plan was stayed under Obama, there was just in order to stay it, there's no explanation. Yesterday there was a little bit of explanation in terms of a couple of members of the court explained some of their thinking.
Yeah.
But I think it was a good day for us.
Yeah, no, we take the good news where we can get it. Vanessa?
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to follow up on the question that Mike asked about Milton and Helene and the misinformation that came before and after those disasters. So you mentioned that the EPA has an Office of Emergency Management for responding to those kinds of crises, but you also said that the mis and disinformation revolving around those catastrophes made it more difficult to have an effective response. And so I'm curious to know, do you think that the EPA has a responsibility to correct or combat some of that mis and disinformation, especially because a lot of it is particularly partisan, and the EPA tries to stay nonpartisan. And if you do think that they have a responsibility, what kind of action can they take? Are there other organizations that could do a better job than the EPA? Do you think the EPA is in the right position to make those kinds of corrections? Anything in that realm?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question, and I think we have been pushing back on that. We've certainly been clear about, and FEMA, which sits over the whole thing, they sort of have their own sort of little channel dedicated just to responding in as real time as is possible to misinformation. So they sort of have on their web page, and I think they're pushing out through a variety of social media channels.
Which is something new.
Responses.
It's
Yeah.
something new to see that sort of response on the part of a government agency.
Even on social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so that's one thing. The second thing is, so I mentioned the administrator is from North Carolina. He's been down there twice since Helene hit. He was down with the president 2 or 3 weeks ago, and went back last week. And so, we're trying hard to get the word out in every way that we can. I think it's, I'll leave it to others to say about how effective it is. I think a lot of it is all of us have our own little individual channels, and so getting information into every person's channel is a challenging thing to do. But I do think FEMA, EPA, other parts of the response are trying new things and really actively trying to bat things down as they come into view.
There are a number of students in the room from a class that Kathleen Holt-Jamieson, the Annenberg Center, and I taught last semester, which focused on, it was climate communication, but their projects focused on disinformation and dispelling myths. And so this really sort of resonates with what we were looking at, and it's interesting to see this development now, where actually we're starting to see some responsiveness on the part of government agencies directly to disinformation. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, Brady. We'll get to yes. So, yeah.
I'm gonna go first. Sure. So you've spoken a bit about the role of the private sector in pushing policies, developing technological innovation, et cetera. I'd be curious to hear your perspective on how adequately the private sector is currently engaged, not only in staying compliant, but also taking advantage of tax incentives, for example, like you've mentioned, and if they're not adequately engaged, why that might be.
Yeah, so I think it's, the answer is probably like your mileage varies a little bit depending on what sector you're talking about, what companies you're talking about. I think that as I said, we put in place some standards on vehicles, on power plants, some of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. We're just now beginning to implement those. We'll be implementing those in the coming years. I think generally, once we have those in place, defend them in court, like compliance with those is generally pretty good. I think on the IRA and in terms of the incentive, the uptake, just one measure of it is that I think it's generally been quite strong. So one measure is there's an arm of Congress called the Congressional Budget Office, and they estimate what legislation is going to cost. If you have revenue raising provisions, how much is it going to bring in? If you have revenue spending provisions, how much they think is going to go out. The uptake on the tax credits, I think, has been 2 or 3x so far what the Congressional Budget Office estimated at the time that the IRA passed. So I think that response has been quite positive. I mean, there's been about $900 billion, almost $1 trillion of investment announced since the IRA was passed, and that's across, I'm not talking now just about IRA, but also the CHIPS Act. So that's across semiconductors, EVs, batteries, renewable energy deployment. So I think the response has been quite strong, but I think we need, and I think it's been one of the strengths of President Biden's approach, kind of carrots and sticks approach, set those standards, but also provide incentives.
Awesome. Quick question and response. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, first of all, thank you so much for being here today. With less than a month until the election and, given how trajectory altering it will be regardless of which candidate wins, I was wondering if you could speak to the EPA's approach right now and what EPA is doing to sort of prepare for alternative outcomes, and what that process looks like with a race that's so tight. Just sort of what the behind the scenes is like right now and what EPA is doing, especially because a lot of the money and things that have been going on right now from this current administration are just beginning to sort of enter places and be deployed. So
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I guess a couple of things in response to that. First of all, at least at EPA, so I mentioned the $100 billion figure between the infrastructure law and the IRA. Of the funding that is available to us now, I think we have obligated, which is a technical term for like obligating the government to spend the money. I think about 90+% of that. I think we'll be pretty close to 100% of that by the end of the year. Some of that funding was, over 5 years, so there's like a couple years, mostly a couple years of water funding left. So I think by and large, by the end of President Biden's time in office, we will have those resources sort of out the door and being deployed and not in a place where they can be clawed back. So that's the first thing. I guess the second thing, probably the more important thing, just thinking about EPA and other parts of the government. So we have about 16,000 employees at EPA. A very, very small fraction of those are appointees, meaning they serve a particular president and administration. And so, the bulk of what we do as an agency, the sort of bread and butter work of EPA is performed by those career civil servants who really comprise the agency and, yes, take direction from the leadership, but, they stay. We come and go, and they stay, and they keep doing the work. And so I think that's, people have been through it before, and I think we'll just continue to do the core work of EPA regardless. And that's just a huge strength of our system of government that we have, that really the core of the executive branch is career civil servants. I met with the leadership of our regional office yesterday, sort of the top career leaders from across water, air, waste, all the different parts of our agency. And it was just amazing how many of them have 20, 25, 30, even 40 years of experience at EPA. And I think that speaks to the mission that EPA is a place to work, but I think it also speaks to the ability of EPA as an agency to be sort of steady, even with changing leadership.
A republic, if you can keep it. All right, thank you, everybody, for coming out for this event.